Hello and welcome to Bearcat Buzz, bringing you everything and anything Willamette. For today's webinar, we have Professor Warren Binford to talk about the U.S. border crisis, more specifically how it began. Warren Binford is a professor of law and the director of the clinical law program at Willamette University College of Law. She is an internationally recognized children's rights scholar and advocate, collaborating with numerous domestic, foreign, and international NGOs. Her contributions have been valuable and to issues both national and international. Please be aware that this webinar will be recorded for future viewing. If you have any questions during the presentation, please be sure to use the questions tab. And if we have any time at the end, we will try to answer it. So without further delay, I'll pass it on to Professor Warren Binford.
Hi, thanks everyone. And I'm so glad that you were willing to join us for today's webinar. What I'd like to do is to explain to you where we're going over the next 4.5 hours. This first session today is part one of a 3-part series. The entire series is called Understanding America's Border Crisis, and the reason why we propose this series is that in talking to people about the challenges that our country faces right now, I've come to appreciate that a lot of people don't have a detailed understanding of how it is that we got to this place in time. And so I thought we would start this series with a first session that's focused on the birth of a border crisis, which is what we're experiencing right now in the United States. And then in the next session, which is scheduled to be next month, we'll focus on America's war on children, which is basically what's been happening between 2017 to the present. And then after that, in February, we'll come together again and we'll focus on how to end the border crisis, because it's really important for everyone to understand that the situation that we are in now, we do have a certain amount of control over, and we have the ability as a nation to formulate laws and policies that can help us to move forward and to provide international leadership with regard to migrant children. So in focusing on today's session, the birth of a border crisis, we're going to talk about not only the United States since the 1920s and what has led us to this place over the last century, but I've also chosen to focus on the country of Guatemala. So the country of Guatemala is, it was selected by me because of the number of children that I've been interviewing in some of the immigration detention facilities around the country. As some of you know, I have had the opportunity to go and interview some of these children and to conduct site visits. And Guatemala is a really good country to focus on in more depth, because not only are more children coming from Guatemala than any other country in the world in recent years, but a lot of the problems that it's facing, the gang violence, the gender violence, the drug trafficking, the poverty, and U.S. interference historically is really emblematic of other countries as well. So, some of the other countries where we're seeing a lot of children coming from include Mexico and El Salvador and Honduras, and some of the problems that we'll talk about today affect those countries as well. To give you an understanding of Guatemala and its population, I need to really compare it to Tennessee. If you want to talk about the land size of Guatemala, that's a comparable U.S. state. And so when you think about gang violence in Guatemala and families trying to escape from those gangs, I want you to be thinking about having to move your family within, or your children within the space of Tennessee, but with a population of basically 15 million people. It's a relatively young country in that it has an average age of 21, and the GDP, the per capita GDP is only about $4,500 a year. So we're looking at over half the population living on less than $2 a day, and so a relatively poor country. This country is located, as you can see on that map of Guatemala, right there at that southern border of Mexico, and so it's relatively close to the United States. It's just one country away, and if you wanted to get from Guatemala to the United States, you could take about a 2.5-hour flight to get here. And if you were going on foot, you're talking about a 1,500-mile walk, either on foot or by cars and buses. And then a lot of children actually jump on a train across Mexico on La Bestia, which is a long train called the Beast that travels through Mexico. So it's relatively close to us, and because of its proximity to us and some of the involvement with the U.S. government that we'll talk about in a few minutes, it has a significant economic dependence on the United States. So basically 60%, approximately what you have is a significant economic dependence where you have 1 million people, Guatemalans, living in the United States right now. And of these, many of them are wiring money from the US, which makes up 2/3 of the country's exports and about 1/10 of Guatemala's gross domestic product. And so you have this close economic dependence that we're going to look at more closely. So let's take a look at the United States and Guatemala and their history over the last century and take a look at what has brought them together in this period of history. So let's focus first on the 1920s. And in the 1920s, what we see is the Immigration Act of 1924. This is not one of the brighter, most enlightened points in American history, because what this is really, a major piece of federal legislation that was intended to control immigration into the United States. And the Immigration Act of 1924 is born really from a very racist perspective. During the turn of the century, between the 1900s and the 20th century, you saw a lot of hostility and a lot of racism, not only towards the African Americans, the blacks who, many of whom were brought here forcibly through slavery, but also a lot of discrimination against Asians, particularly Chinese. And so the Immigration Act of 1924 tried to limit immigration based upon race and ethnicity, placing strict quotas on immigration from different regions, particularly from Asia. And it was that racist framework that led to our immigration policies being born from a perspective of racism being the most important thing driving who gets to come to the United States and work here and be a US citizen. At the same time, at the same year that Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, they also created the Border Patrol. And so what you have is a Border Patrol that is being created at the same time that we start to want to limit our immigration based on race. And I think that may have contributed to a certain DNA or perspective in the creation of the Border Patrol that we continue to wrestle with to this day. At the same time that we had the Immigration Act of 1924 being based on race and ethnicity and the creation of the Border Patrol at the same time, we also saw the growth of corporate interests in Central America, including Guatemala. So the United Fruit Corporation was a U.S. corporation that traded in tropical fruit, and it was just completing its grand building on Charles Avenue, which is what you see here in New Orleans. This building was largely funded by profits that were being made in a variety of countries, not only in Latin America, but also in the Caribbean. These countries included several of the countries that we're talking about in Central America, including Guatemala and Honduras as well. In Central America, the United Fruit Corporation controlled large swaths of land in the region, and they controlled transportation networks as well. In Guatemala alone, the United Fruit Corporation ran the postal service, it ran the telegraph, and it quickly became the largest employer in Central America. Before the people of Central America started to push back, and there were labor strikes in both Costa Rica and Honduras in protest of the United Fruit Corporation's exploitative labor practices, the corporation's bribery of government officials in those countries, and also the control of the country's economy, the politics, and the infrastructure. In fact, it was the United Fruit Corporation's control of these countries that gave rise to the derogatory term banana republics, because that's where the United Fruit Company was making its money. And this is where the countries really weren't able to develop strong and independent governments. The problem with the United Fruit Company's practices is that they developed what are known as enclave economies. And this means that the economic activity that was designed around the company really protects the company interests and its investors, and that it doesn't enrich local communities. And so it's a very exploitative company structure. In addition to that, the business activities of the United Fruit Company was creating significant, devastating damage to the natural environments in the region. And so a lot of the people who were living in these countries started to push back. So in the 1940s, in focusing on the Guatemala's response to the United Fruit Company and its exploitative practice, basically what happened is in 1944, the Guatemalan people engaged in an uprising to try and gain control over their assets. They wanted to have more worker protections. They wanted to have more control over their lands because so much of the land was foreign owned, especially by the United Fruit Company, this U.S. corporation. At that time, the United Fruit Corporation actually controlled 42% of the land in Guatemala. And not only did it control their land, but it was exempted from paying taxes and import duties. And so it was very much an exploitative presence in Guatemala. On top of that, Guatemalan experts went to the United States, predominantly 77% of Guatemalan experts actually went to the United States, and 65% of the imports came from the US. And so, you know, what we're looking at is this really, really close economic relationship between the United States and Guatemala, but by a company that's engaging in exploitative worker practices. The working conditions were really horrendous, you know, as was the pay, which was just a pittance. And so, you know, these conditions gave rise to the Guatemalan citizens rising up and launching this revolution in 1944. And what they did was basically, the person who was in power at that point in time, Jorge Ubico, was a military strongman who was backed by the US government. He was a dictator who basically did whatever United Fruit Company wanted to do. And after he was overthrown by the Guatemalan citizens, what they did was they elected, I love this part, a professor of philosophy, Juan Jose Arevalo Bermejo. And, you know, and Dr. Bermejo immediately started to try and implement a number of social reforms, such as increasing the minimum wage and launching a series of literacy programs to expand education in Guatemala. And here's something else that I love, is that one of the first things he did was to oversee the adoption of a constitution that was modeled on the US Constitution. Now, this professor, you know, democratically elected president, was amazing in that he was able to survive like 25 coup attempts during his presidency, which only lasted about 6 years, when he was replaced by Jacobo Arbenz. And Arbenz was someone who was born into a moderately wealthy family, but then his family experienced some economic hardships, and he ended up entering the military because he wasn't able to go straight to university because his family didn't have the money. And during his time in the military, he witnessed some of the chain gangs that were being used as forced labor by the United Fruit Company and also by the Guatemalan government in trying to advance corporate interests and this US-backed government, which had been overthrown. And so he developed these very progressive social views, and he expanded the social reforms that had been taken, that were implemented by the first democratically elected president of Guatemala. And he expanded the right to vote, and he recognized the rights of workers to organize into unions. And this was what was really controversial. He legitimized several political parties and protected free speech. And so when I talk about the fact that he legitimized several political parties, really the really controversial thing that he did here was that he allowed the Communist Party in Guatemala to be recognized. Now, in a country that had approximately 2 million people at the time, we're only talking about a few thousand people who were members in the Communist Party. But that fact was used by the United Fruit Company to try and organize a disinformation campaign about him and the democratically elected government in Guatemala. But even more important than his legalizing the Communist Party in Guatemala, which, you know, is a very small and very weak party, what really infuriated the United Fruit Company is that he implemented an agrarian reform law that basically said any land that the United Fruit Company and other corporate interests own in Guatemala that have not yet been developed, we're going to buy that land from those companies, and we're going to give it to the peasants, that we're going to give it to what was essentially about 500,000 impoverished workers that had been exploited and were predominantly made up of indigenous people. And as you saw from that first slide, when we looked at Guatemala, you saw that the majority of Guatemalans are from indigenous populations. And so they had been dispossessed previously by the Spanish invasion, but we're not going to go by that far in history, but just know that we're talking about a group that were, the original occupants of residents of Guatemala who had been previously dispossessed under colonial rule and had continued to be exploited and impoverished by practices by other more powerful countries. And so, the second democratically elected president, President Arbenz, was trying to give them some assets so that they could achieve economic independence and be less susceptible to economic exploitation, such as what we saw with the United Fruit Company. So, not surprisingly, it was that, actually, I think that we are missing a slide here because I want to go to U.S. interference. So, okay, sorry. Focusing on what happened after Arbenz was elected and passed this agrarian land reform, the United Fruit Companies tried to lobby the U.S. government. First, they lobbied President Truman, and then after he was replaced by President Eisenhower, the United Fruit Company carried out this misinformation campaign, and they basically said that the Guatemalan government was closely aligned with the Soviet Union. Remember that this is happening at the time of the Cold War, when people were scared of the Soviet threat, and it was presented that the Soviets were in our backyard basically, and we're going to expand their hold in Central America, foothold in Central America, and eventually invade the United States. And so a big deal was made of this, and the fact is that it wasn't actually a fair or accurate presentation of what the Guatemalan government's relationship was to the Soviet Union. But that didn't stop the United Fruit Company from telling both the presidents and Congress that that's what was going on. On top of that, what they did was the United Fruit Company carried out this disinformation campaign to the point that they did some propaganda footage and distributed it to media and talked about why the Soviets hate bananas, and invited all of these top media from the New York Times and everywhere else to go down to Central America, to go to Guatemala, and the United Fruit Company paid for their travel and everything, and so that they could see firsthand that the United Fruit Company, this U.S. corporation, was basically defending democracy in Guatemala, and but for the United Fruit Company, that Guatemala would fall to, in the Cold War, to the Soviet Union, and then, we would be invaded. And so what ended up happening is that narrative got a foothold, and on top of that, a shocking number of members of President Eisenhower's intimate circle, his close circle, all had ties to the United Fruit Company. So, for example, his private secretary was married to the top PR executive at the United Fruit Company. Also, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, he was with the law firm that represented the United Fruit Company. And then his brother, who was Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA under Eisenhower, he served on the board of directors of the United Fruit Company, and he was also a shareholder. So basically, you have this closely intertwined administration, the Eisenhower administration, with the United Fruit Company, and the United Fruit Company was urging the U.S. government to overthrow Arbenz because it was a threat to their company interests and was being, misportrayed as being, a communist threat, which it wasn't. And so the Eisenhower administration, unfortunately, agreed to do that. And so in 1954, the U.S. government launched a covert CIA operation, which which was codenamed PBS Success. And that was launched from the neighboring country of Honduras, where the United Fruit Company had a chokehold. Now, this attack was really ridiculous because it was kind of a joke, but the Guatemalan people didn't know about it. There were there were only a limited number of troops, but what happened was the U.S. sent planes over Guatemala and did strategic bombing in the Guatemala City, and they, in their radio broadcast, they gave the impression that there was a much larger force and that this was a much more aggressive attack than it really was. And what the U.S. did was they set up one of the historical opponents, military opponents of President Arbenz to take over. And because the Guatemalan people were so scared and thought this was a major military offensive, they did not defend the Guatemalan government from this foreign attack that was backed by the U.S. government. And what ended up happening is the United States removed President Arbenz from office through this overthrow, ending democracy in Guatemala, and in his place they installed a military strongman. And then for the next 40 years, basically, Guatemala was led by a series of military strongmen who were backed by the U.S. government. Now, at the same time, we're going to switch gears a little bit here and focus on what else was going on in the United States at that time, independent of its relationship with Guatemala. So in the 1950s, we saw what has been listed as basically the largest deportation in U.S. history. And this also was undertaken by the Eisenhower administration. And this deportation was originally conducted initiated at the request of the Mexican government. And basically what had happened here is that throughout history, and when I say throughout history, I mean for the last 130 years or so, we have had a lot of labor coming back and forth across the U.S. border. The reason for that is that the United States has a large agricultural history, and that we often need seasonal laborers who are willing to work in what are very challenging, very harsh conditions, and often for exploitative pay. In recent years, it's included a lot of exposure to a lot of carcinogenics in the fields, and it's sometimes hard to find this labor. And it was especially hard during World War II, when so many of our young men were sent off to fight in World War II. And so Mexico doesn't really like, historically, it didn't really like sending its labor up to the United States to work for low wages and in uncomfortable conditions, exploitative conditions, because frankly, Mexico wants that labor itself. Mexico wants to develop just like the United States wants to develop, just like Guatemala wants to develop. And so when its cheap labor goes to the United States to work, it means that Mexico can't utilize that labor in developing its infrastructure. So although Mexico, historically had objected to Mexican laborers going up to the United States, what it did say is that it would enter into a treaty with the United States that would allow Mexican workers to come to the United States for a limited period of time if they sent part of their money back to Mexico in the form of private savings accounts. The Mexican government required that not only its workers be provided with a safe place to live and food, but that they would be also paid a minimum wage, so that it made sure that it was worth the workers' time, and that also, as I said, those remittances would be sent back to Mexico. Now, remember at the beginning when I was talking about Guatemala, I talked about how much of the economy is made up of remittances, wire transfers from the United States to Guatemala. This is the same kind of economic transfer, financial transfer that we were seeing in the area in the 1940s between the United States and Mexico, and that we actually see throughout Latin America and the United States. Is laborers coming up to the United States at the request of the United States and at the request of United States employers. We take advantage of those people, and then they send that money back to their home countries in order to support their families and also to advance the economic development in those countries. So basically what you see are the U.S. actively arranging for cheap labor from other countries to the south when needed, And this continued from not only 1942, but it was continued through 1964 when it ended. And throughout that time, the United States was actively recruiting these people to come and work here. So here's the irony, which is that, we always, whenever we think of border security, we think of it coming from the United States and the United States wanting to protect itself from people in other countries. Well, that's not actually the complete story. When this Bracero program was founded, what the Mexican government wanted was for the United States to do a better job of securing their border. So yes, we had the Border Patrol being created in the 1920s to better control our borders, secure our borders, but we also have the Mexican government saying, hey, would you please secure the borders because we want to keep our workers here in Mexico. We don't want them going over to the United States and being exploited there when we can utilize them here. And so the U.S. did agree to do a better job of tightening their border security in order to keep Mexican workers in Mexico, except for those that they wanted to allow legally through the Bracero program. The problem is that in the midst of all this, a lot of the employers and a lot of the workers didn't like the regulations under the Bracero program, and so the U.S. employers and the Mexican workers continued to have labor coming across the border into the United States, without the appropriate documentation and outside of that program. And it was this population that the Eisenhower administration tried to deport during, the operation called Operation Wetback, which is, as so offensive because that's a derogatory term to refer to Mexicans. And it can either, there are different etymologies that are described for that term, but some people say that it is referring to when they come across the Rio Grande River from Mexico to the United States, that they're wet, and then other people say that it's because of hairstyles, but basically, they use this derogatory term to refer to Mexican laborers who were coming over here, and it was such an aggressive deportation that basically what happened here, you see some of these pictures that they just rounded up people, over 1 million people. They did not have a chance to, get their assets to, many of them had bank accounts and houses and cars and families. They even deported U.S. citizens. And it wasn't just that they deported these laborers, but they actually deported them to the interior of Mexico in order to make it harder for them to return to the United States. And so they removed them from their families and their assets in the United States and then deported them to an area of Mexico that they had no relationship with, where their family didn't exist, their communities weren't there, and they used planes and ships and buses and trains to send these people here. So it's a really horrific point in our history because, as I say, we actively were recruiting this population to come here, and then they come, and not surprisingly, other people came too, and then they very aggressively deported people without much thoughtfulness or carefulness or humanity during that deportation process. So let's move forward from the 1950s to the 1960s. So not surprisingly, after the United States overthrew the Guatemalan government, with this covert CIA operation, PBS Success, it really created a vacuum. It was a vacuum in leadership in that country because suddenly you have yet another U.S.-backed dictator who was allowing the people of Guatemala to continue to be exploited by U.S. corporate interests, and this gave rise to the Guatemalan Civil War. Now, there has been a lot of civil war, a lot of our conflict in Central America, not surprisingly, in a post-colonial context, and then in light of the exploitation of the region by U.S. corporate interests. But the Guatemalan Civil War was the longest and the deadliest civil war in this region. It actually lasted 36 years, so 4 decades, almost 4 decades. And basically what happened was the U.S. sent in military to the region in order to provide training You know, and we provided arms in, you know, not only this armed conflict, but other Central American armed conflicts. And basically hundreds of thousands of Guatemalan citizens, primarily Mayans and other indigenous groups, were killed or, you know, disappeared. You know, of course, disappearance program. It really was a form of genocide, widespread genocide in Guatemala. And basically, those who weren't killed or disappeared were displaced, particularly the indigenous groups. And, you know, over 1 million Mayan villagers were displaced during this war. And although we did not see a significant migration flow to the US from Guatemala in the 60s, we did start to see an increased migration flow to the United States from Guatemala in the 70s, especially after a massive earthquake in 1976. So also in the 1960s, as you know, this is where we started to see the civil rights movement in the United States. And we started to try and confront our racist history as a country. And what we tried to do was to advance equal rights for all members of our society and to move away from the racist heritage that was reflected in many areas of society, from the housing policies and desegregated schools, and also immigration laws were one of the things that was tackled. And so what happened was in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson and a bipartisan Congress decided to replace the 1924 immigration law with the Immigration and Nationality Act, which continues to be the law to this day in the United States of America. Instead, under the Immigration and Nationality Act that was passed in 1965, the immigration system that was based on racism ended, and it was replaced with an immigration legal system that was focused on family reunification and skilled workers. So we're replacing racism and bigotry here with family and skilled labor force. President Lyndon Johnson called the immigration system, the old immigration system, downright un-American, and said that this new comprehensive immigration law, which was focused on families and strengthening the American workforce, was intended to correct a, quote, cruel and enduring wrong in the conduct of the American nation. The Immigration and Nationality Act, I want to just focus on kids for a second because that's where my expertise is, allows for expedited removal of undocumented persons, but it does not allow for expedited removal of children, because children are supposed to have special treatment in light of their unique status of children. And in addition to the INA providing special status for children, the INA also recognizes that if an undocumented person claims asylum, and during an credible fear interview, they're able to establish with an asylum officer that they have a credible fear of persecution in their home country, then they are to be exempted from expedited removal, and instead are supposed to be put into standard removal proceedings for consideration of their asylum claims or other claims for relief from removal from the U.S. This is something that I want to fast forward to today and just explain something to you. There are a lot of people who talk about illegal aliens. And what's important for everyone to understand is that if someone comes to the United States without proper documentation, it is a misdemeanor. Unless they are here to claim asylum, they are allowed to enter the United States for the purpose of claiming asylum, even if they don't have documentation. So that is something that excludes them from that status of illegal aliens. It's not appropriate when you're talking about asylum seekers. If they try and enter a second time, then it is a felony. So what we're talking about here is a misdemeanor if they enter the United States under the Immigration and Nationality Act, a misdemeanor the first time they enter the United States without appropriate documentation, and a felony the second time, unless they are here to claim asylum, in which case they are welcome and to come and apply for asylum, because that is a commitment that our country has made. and that we continue to be obligated to uphold under both federal law, such as the INA, as well as international law. So at the same time in the 1960s, we also saw a rising organization around the farm workers. So we talked earlier in this webinar about the fact that we historically have been encouraging people to come to the United States to work in our fields, backbreaking work, horrible pay, horrible working conditions, very exploitative, something that a lot of US citizens are not willing to do. And so as we had this influx of Mexican workers who were coming to work in our fields, both legally and without documentation, we ended up having a rising organization to protect worker rights and ensure that workers are not exploited. And so this gave rise to a labor union called the United Farm Workers. And basically, as they started to fight for their a protection of their rights, it gave rise to the need to strike in order to try and force farmers and agricultural farmers and as well as agricultural companies to treat these farm workers better. And it also gave rise to some conflicts with undocumented workers coming from Mexico who were willing to cross the strike line and replace the workers who had been hired legally. And so what we see here are lots of conflicts happening between the governments, the Mexican government and the US government, who both want cheap labor, and the farm workers themselves, both those who are here legally, through different labor programs, labor treaties that we entered into, who came to the United States under those lawful programs, and then trying to improve their working conditions, and then other migrant laborers who want to come and try and better their own lives. And so we're coming to the United States and undermining the labor movement in order to advance those labor conditions here, in order to advance their own individual and family interests. So a lot of tremendous need for labor here, and a lot of conflict around how to meet the United States agricultural needs and labor needs at the same time that we protect workers' interests. So in the light of all this, we move to the 1980s, which is, this is basically the Reagan years. And what happened here is that you have all this conflict going on in Central America because, at least in part, because of the US interference in Central American countries. And people will, of course, remember the Iran-Contra deal, where we basically were secretly engaged in getting arms to transfer to Central America. And the federal government was involved in getting arms transferred to Central America in order to back our strong arm leaders in that region. And so we were sending people to actually train different groups in Central America, in addition to providing arms. And at the same time that we were doing this, the Reagan administration passed some an Immigration Reform and Control Act in concert with Congress, and this happened in 1986. And basically what they did was they tried to penalize businesses that knowingly were hiring undocumented workers. So on that last slide where we talked about the conflicts that were occurring with these different groups, this is what we're talking about, that President Reagan and congressional leaders decided to go after the employers themselves and say, hey, you should not be knowingly hiring people who don't have appropriate documentation. And in passing that law, President Reagan went and he stood beside the newly refurbished Statue of Liberty, and he said, quote, the legalization provisions in this act will go far to improve the lives of a class of individuals who now must hide in the shadows, without access to many of the benefits of a free and open society. Very soon, many of these men and women will be able to step into the sunlight, and ultimately, if they choose, they may become Americans, close quote. And so basically, what we have is, as part of this act, the law legalized most of the undocumented people who were already living in the United States prior to 1982, including tens of thousands of Guatemalans who had come in the 1970s and 80s, early 80s, because of the Guatemalan Civil War and because of the earthquake. And basically what President Reagan's talking about is that if you look at people who do not have a recognized place in society, that they tend to be subject to exploitation and experience a lot of vulnerabilities. This can be reflected in mental health outcomes, in physical health outcomes, in economic advancement. They're much more likely to be trafficked. And so it's really, really important that we provide paths to citizenship for people who are living in a part of society in order to protect them from exploitation. And this is in fact what President Reagan and Congress were trying to do in 1986, where they legalized most of the undocumented people who were already living in the US. But the fact is that this new law that was focused on going after the employers who hired people who did not have proper documentation for employment in the agricultural industry, not just the agricultural industry, also restaurants and hotels and things like that, it didn't really deter at all. In fact, it's interesting because undocumented residents in the United States have more than doubled since then. And this really, for those of us who look closely at this area of the law, isn't really surprising to some of us, because there is a body of research that suggests that when immigration policies that are harsh are implemented, it actually can lead to an increase in immigration, and including undocumented immigration, because some people, one of the theories is that people say, oh my gosh, they're getting serious now, so we better hurry up and get to that country before our chance is lost. And in fact, we did see a continuing rise of immigration, undocumented immigration, following these harsher laws that were passed. Something else that started to happen during this period was the rise of mass incarceration, and we're going to talk about that more in the 1990s as part of the Clinton years. But it's important for you to understand that we were starting to move away from incarceration, particularly related to immigration in the mid 20th century, and that we really in the late 20th century and early 21st century have fought very significantly at great cost to society, both financially and otherwise. We bought into this mass incarceration culture. So let me tell you my favorite part about the 1980s, which is that this is the period when a lawsuit that creates the standards for the protection of children's rights who come to the United States. This is when this was filed, and basically what happened is in this lawsuit called Flores versus Meese at the time, it subsequently, basically the name of this case changes based on whoever the Attorney General is at any point in time. So it went from Flores versus Meese to Flores versus Reno to today Flores versus Barr. So most people just refer to this case as Flores. And basically what happened was in Flores, the Reagan administration through the INS was holding some children in immigration detention facilities, which weren't really immigration detention facilities. They were really horrendous places. Jenny Lisette Flores, for whom the lawsuit is named, was being held in a dilapidated abandoned hotel in Los Angeles that was surrounded by razor wire. And she was being kept with unrelated adults. She had been fleeing civil war in El Salvador, as were her parents. She wasn't enrolled in school, given any educational opportunities. There were no appropriate activities for her. And she was subject to strip searches. And basically, she was being held as bait by INS so that INS could arrest her and her undocumented parents. And they refused to release her to any other adults, even though she had other family members who were documented in the United States and wanted to collect her so that she wasn't in these horrendous conditions. In addition to Jenny, there was another plaintiff in this class action suit, Anna Marie Martinez Portillo. And Anna Marie was being held in Laredo, Texas by the Corrections Corporation of America. So when I started talking about the rise of mass incarceration culture, the Corrections Corporation of America is one of the companies that I'm talking about, where not only do we see mass incarceration, but you see mass incarceration in for-profit prisons that are being paid buckets full of money by the U.S. taxpayers in order to lock up kids and others. So in any event, Anna Marie was not only also being held by the INS, in that case through the CCA, but she was also being subject to vaginal searches in addition to the strict searches that Jenny Flores was. So basically what happened was there was this superhero, two superheroes, Carlos Holtman, who's with the Center for Human Rights and Constitutional Law, and then one of my mentors, Alice Boussier of the Youth Law Center. They found out about these conditions, and what they did was they brought a class action on behalf of all of the children being held by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and they filed this class action lawsuit in 1985. This is really important for you to pay attention to the fact that I just said that the class includes all of the children being held by U.S. immigration officials, because that is an issue that is continuing to this day. So basically, under Flores, that lawsuit was litigated for the next 12 years. It went all the way to 1997. And during that time, it went, to the Ninth Circuit, through the district court, up to the Ninth Circuit, all the way to the Supreme Court and back down again. Along the way, there were some limited settlements that were reached between the U.S. government and the children's attorneys until finally it was settled in 1997. And we're going to switch to the settlement in a minute. But before we do that, I want to talk about something else that was going on in the 1980s. Which was America's war on drugs. So basically, during this time, what we were seeing is that let me just put it bluntly, America has a problem with drugs. We have an insatiable appetite for drugs. And basically, in the late 20th century, our appetite for drugs gave rise to a significant market that is sourced largely out of South America. And then those drugs, America is the primary market for those drugs. And those drugs are then sent through Central America to the United States to feed our drug habit. And so what ends up happening in the 1980s and the 90s is that we have this drug war, which we then, don't fight effectively and allow Guatemala and the other Central American countries to be stuck in the epicenter of that. So we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about gangs and the rise of gangs in the 1990s, where we're going to go now. So looking at the 1990s, this is when the Guatemala Civil War finally ended. In the early 90s, when the Guatemalan Civil War was still raging, this is when we really started to see a significant increase, a significant number of asylum seekers coming from Guatemala to the United States. So approximately 40% of asylum seekers during this period of time in the early 1990s were coming from Guatemala. And then we saw even more coming because of a series of natural disasters. So we've talked a lot in society in the last couple of years about climate change and the way in which the climate crisis is contributing to more hurricanes and things like that. And the fact is that we've actually been seeing some of these effects for a while now. So Hurricane Mitch in 1998 really impacted Guatemala. And then later there was Hurricane Stan in 2005 and Hurricane Agatha and other environmental events in 2010 and 2011. But basically all of these things contribute to an increased number of people increasingly migrating from Guatemala to the United States. And there's no question that the United States has played a significant role in contributing to climate change. And we're going to have to play a role in combating the challenge of how to manage climate change related migration. But we actually have already seen some of it starting in the 1990s and coming forward to today. In addition to the increase of asylum seekers that we saw from Guatemala in the early 1990s, and then after some of these environmental disasters happened in the later 1990s, we eventually saw the end of the Guatemalan Civil War, but not without the aftermath of that Civil War. So some of the things that we saw in Guatemala during this time was, with the weak and under-resourced state that came to power at the end of the Civil War, you saw a rise of gangs and paramilitary groups in the region. You also saw a really weak economy, which created a lack of jobs in Guatemala, and then you also have a lot of issues with the patriarchy in Guatemala and all of many of these Central American countries, and in Mexico, where you have a high rate of both domestic violence as well as femicide. That it is far too common for women to be killed in Guatemala. Guatemala has one of the highest, the world's highest rates of femicide, and often, when we interview some of these families about why they left a Central American country, including Guatemala, they talk about instances of family members being raped and tortured and physically mutilated before being killed. And so these are all problems that we see in Guatemala, and part of what contributed to the large number of asylum seekers that we saw coming from Guatemala during the end of the Civil War and after it ended. So in getting back to another big development in the 1990s, as I mentioned, it was 1997 when that Flores case settled. So that began in 1985, as we talked about, focusing on the 1980s. And it was litigated for the next 12 years. And finally, after it got all the way to the Supreme Court, the US government and the children's attorneys sat down together and said, okay, let's just agree that we are going to not lock children up, that children should not be locked up. So we're gonna go ahead and adopt this policy to release children who arrive in the United States without documentation. And we're going to release them to the parents. And if their parents aren't available, then we're going to release them to another adult relative living in the United States. And if there's not another adult relative living in the United States, then we're going to release them to another adult living in the United States who is authorized by the parents, not the government, by the parents, authorized by the parents to care for the child. And only if there's no parent/legal guardian living in the United States who can care for this child, and if there's no other adult relatives living in the United States who can care for this child, and if there's no other adult authorized by the parents living with the child, only then does the child need to be cared for by the government, and then it must be in a license. Now remember that word license. A license program in the least restrictive setting possible. And that all facilities where children are to be kept, all facilities will ensure that they are safe and sanitary, and that these facilities address the unique vulnerabilities of children. And more important, children must be given access to toilets and sinks, drinking water, food, medical assistance, adequate temperature control and ventilation, adequate supervision, and the children will have contact with any family members with whom they were apprehended. And so what we're talking about is nothing significant. I mean, who among us would argue that children don't belong with families? As a matter of fact, this is something that you should know. In recent reports from the US government about the children who are being apprehended by the US government, the US government reports that 89% of the children being released from the government are being released to those first three categories of parents, other family members, or other authorized adults living in the United States. We're talking about very few children who need to be in the United States care. And that while they are there, that they should basically be fed, not frozen or overheated or anything like that. And it's really, really important to know that there's some language in here which requires that federal authorities treat, quote, all minors with dignity, respect, and special concern for their particular vulnerability as minors. So, close quote. So what happened, what this means is that basically these kids are supposed to be treated well while they're in the government's care, and that the US government voluntarily agreed to these things as a result of, the Flores lawsuit. Now, the Flores settlement agreement was not originally intended to last forever. It was assumed that the government would come into compliance. And so originally the Flores settlement agreement said that it would terminate 3 years after the court determined that the INS was in substantial compliance with the terms of settlement, or 5 years after the court approved the Flores settlement agreement. But that was subsequently changed in the 2000s. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But first I want to talk to you about something else that was going on in the 1990s. So also in the 1990s, what we saw was a rise of gangs being deported from the United States to Central America. And where this came from was the Clinton years, and basically in the same way that Reagan left his mark on immigration, President Clinton also left his mark on immigration, and he did it in working with Congress to pass the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, and this basically amended the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act. And this is super, super important. The IIRIRA expressly affirmed the commitment of the US government, US Congress, and the executive branch to protect the rights of those seeking asylum. So people who are coming to the United States of America for the purpose of seeking asylum, we affirmed our commitment to them in the 1990s. In addition to that, this particular statute cracked down on criminal activity. And the crackdown on criminal activity led to the mass deportation of members of several LA gangs. And basically what happened was these gangs, which included MS-13, which is a Salvadorian gang, and also the 18th Street gang, or Law 18, it has a variety of names. Law 18 is a multi-ethnic, multiracial international gang that was founded in LA. MS-13, as I mentioned, was an El Salvadorian gang, and that also was founded in LA. That basically what happened was members of those gangs were deported from LA, where we weren't able to get the gang situation under control, and to Central America, where then the gangs plugged into all of those bad things that we had just talked about were starting to happen in Central America, such as the drug trafficking to feed our insatiable drug appetite, and arms trafficking and human trafficking and stuff like that. And with the vacuum that was created by overthrowing the fledgling democracy in Guatemala, the gangs ended up filling part of that power vacuum and continue to control large areas of Central America to this day. And so we have this spreading of the gangs into Central America as a direct response or a direct consequence of the immigration reform that was passed in the 1990s under President Clinton. So let's talk about what happened in the 2000s that has contributed to the crisis that we have today. So the first thing that happened in the 2000s is that I'm just waiting for the slide to catch up with me. And it looks like we might have there we go, we're moving again. So the first thing that happened during this time is that in 2001, the government and the US government and the children's attorneys came together. And basically what they agreed is that rather than have the Flores settlement agreement, these standards for children in detention and this policy favoring release and making sure that the children are released to their families here in the United States, that rather than have that terminate after the INS is in compliance or after a certain passage of time, that the settlement agreement would terminate 45 days after the government published regulations that would implement the the standards for children in detention and immigration detention. Now, this is really, really important, so I need for you to hold on to this knowledge until our next meeting, because basically what's happening right now is that those regulations were not promulgated by President Bush. They weren't promulgated by President Clinton, you know, when this was settled in 1997, and they weren't promulgated by President Bush and the Knots, and they weren't promulgated by President Obama, and they were promulgated just this year by President Trump. And basically the regulations which you see on your screen right here is what you know, was circulated last year and this when these rules were being announced. And basically these rules are being challenged because they bear no resemblance to the Flores Settlement Agreement. And so what happened was the children's attorneys have challenged these regulations and say they're basically a breach of contract because they bear no resemblance to the standards. They basically allow for children to be held indefinitely with their families, which is a violation of Flores. And so what happened was the children's attorneys brought a motion alleging anticipatory breach and an actual breach, and the Trump administration has challenged that ruling. They've appealed it to the Ninth Circuit. A panel of the Ninth Circuit, a motions panel, has granted the Trump administration's expedited appeal. And so the government's briefing is due this month on December 21st, I think it is. And then the children's attorney's brief will be due next month on January 20th. And then the amicus briefs, and I'm working on one of those amicus briefs now, is due on January 28th. So pay attention to what I'm telling you about these regulations, because what happened in 2001 when the parties changed the Flores Settlement Agreement is directly related to what's going on right now in the Ninth Circuit, and it's anticipated that that challenge will be taken to the Supreme Court by whatever party loses, so at the Ninth Circuit level. So let's then focus on, so the Flores Settlement Agreement is changed in the early 2000s, and then of course everybody knows that in 2001, around this same time, we experienced 9/11. And basically the aftermath of 9/11, there were several things that were consequences of 9/11. One is that there was this movement by our government to conflate immigration with counterterrorism initiatives. And so the U.S. Patriot Act was passed very quickly, and that basically reorganized the federal government and created the Department of Homeland Security. It dissolved Immigration and Naturalization Services and then redistributed its responsibilities. So it created the Patriot Act, created ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and placed that under the newly created Department of Homeland Security. It also put Border Patrol under the Department of Homeland Security, and it created the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the part of the government that administers the United States Immigration and Naturalization System, so kind of the administrative branch of this. Now, in addition to organizing, disbanding INS, dissolving INS, creating, USCIS, creating ICE, putting Border Patrol under the Department of Homeland Security, the other thing that happened at this time was in 2002, we passed the Homeland Security Act. And what the Homeland Security Act provided was actually protection for children. So the Homeland Security Act basically recognized that children should not be in the custody of the same people who are responsible for arresting them and prosecuting them. And so this act moved the children's care from INS, where it had been up to this point in time, to ORR, so the Office of Refugee Resettlement, under the Department of Health and Human Services, so another federal agency. And so this was an attempt to bifurcate children's care, immigrant children's care, from the government organizations that arrest and prosecute the children. In addition to passing the 2010 Homeland Security Act, the Clinton administration passed the 2000 Trafficking Victim Protection Act in again in the year 2000, I just said that. And what was significant about this act is that it provided for the child's best interest to be a determination for, how unaccompanied and separated children should be processed and where they should be placed by the U.S. government. That's really important because it ties into an international movement that was happening in this time, which is that the child's best interest is something that became the cornerstone of the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child. That was developed over a 10-year period from 1979 to 1989, and the U.S. contributed more language to that treaty and more edits to that treaty, more revisions to that treaty than any other country that contributed, and that was adopted by the UN's General Assembly in 1989, and basically today that has been signed by every country on the planet, every recognized country on the planet, and has been ratified by every country on the planet except for one, which is the US. So the US Senate has not yet given its consent for that, the ratification of that by the president. But this best interest policy with regard to children has really become a universal policy to guide decisions that we make about children, and you see it in both state and federal law, including in this case around the best interests of immigrant children. In addition to the TVPA, the next administration, President Bush's administration, also passed a law that expanded protections for children in migration. And what George Bush did in reauthorizing the Trafficking Victim Protection Act is he limited, and the Congress limited, the detention of children or the placement of children in the care of the Customs and Border Patrol to 72 hours. And that's really important because everybody recognizes that Border Patrol facilities are not where children should be. Remember that in Florida, they're supposed to be in licensed facilities. And so it was recognized by everybody that children need to be moved out of Border Patrol facilities as quickly as possible within a few hours, and and not more than 72 hours in normal circumstances, and that they should go straight from Border Patrol to that Office of Refugee Resettlement. The exception to this is that children who are from Mexico and Canada have the option to voluntarily return to their home country rather than to be transferred into ORR care. Also during the time, this is really where we started to see the rise of private for-profit prisons at the beginning of the 21st century. We've already talked about the CCA, and we're going to see more of those in the 2010s. So let's go ahead and look at what's been happening most recently in the last 7 years. So starting with, what we're seeing here is that in the 2010s, we continue to have an immigration system that's based upon family integrity and the merit of workers and who want to come to the United States. Either, people who want to be here because they have family members here or because they have qualifications as potential employees that make them desirable for the purposes of advancing our economy and our society and things like that. And that we also continue to have protections for asylum seekers who cannot return to their home countries due to threats of safety. And the authority to grant asylum to a non-citizen is vested in the U.S. Attorney General. And so we've already talked about the fact that in order for someone to claim asylum, they have to have a well-founded fear of persecution, and that persecution has to be based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and I want you to pay attention to that, or political opinion. So if you look at the number of apprehensions at the U.S. border in recent years, what you see, and look at that in the context of the history that we've just gone over, and you can see that rise in immigration in the 70s as we saw more and more laborers coming to the United States. We saw that spike in 1986 around the time that we had that that harsh immigration law that was passed that, as I mentioned, sometimes leads to an increase in immigration rather than a decrease. So that's happening around that same time. And then if you look at it, we've got more harsh immigration practices being introduced by the Clinton administration in the 90s. You see another spike there. And then there are no harsh immigration laws that are passed in subsequent years. And what we see is, in fact, a decrease in the overall number of apprehensions. But what you do see when you start to look at the teens in, or the 2010s is an increase in the number of unaccompanied children and family unit members. And so that's how migration started to change in the 2010s. Let me talk to you a little bit about where this came from. So in the 2010s, US courts recognized that both survivors of domestic violence, this is that gender-based violence that we talked about earlier, that we see in Central America, that can qualify, survivors of domestic violence can claim membership in a particular social group. And the courts also held that kids and adults who are targeted by gangs for recruitment and refuse to join the gang can also qualify for asylum as members of a particular social group. And so what ended up happening during this time is that in the 2010s, we saw more and more people who were coming to the United States to claim asylum because of the gang violence, because of the drug trafficking, coming up to the U.S. market, because of the gender-based violence. We talked to a lot of girls during our interviews who described gang members trying to force them into a form of sex slavery. And so they're running away from that. As I mentioned, families describe members of the family who have been killed by the gangs, or different gang members because they refuse to, to be a sex slave to a gang member. And so they end up being, raped and killed and often dismembered. And so, so we saw a significant increase in the number of women and children coming for the purpose of claiming asylum. And that it was really this change in the demographics that contributed to the, the modern day crisis. And we first see this under President Obama, where in 2014, we saw a sharp increase. If you look at that, at the blue and the green, you see larger and larger numbers of unaccompanied children in that green coming across the border, and 2014 was the year that we had the largest number of kids coming in from Central America to try and escape this. And those of us who are children's rights advocates, who are children's advocates, we were really, really critical of the Obama administration because they were keeping kids for on average for about 30 days, 29, 30 days during the administration. And they were trying to cope with this crisis of not so much increased migration, but rather increased migration of women and children, and particularly unaccompanied children. And basically what happened is it was under the Obama administration that we started to gather those pictures of children in cages, which is so upsetting to so many of us, and which everybody, so many people are trying to end because it's a violation of the children's rights, and it's a violation of Flores, and the children shouldn't be there. They should be with families. That's, those are the values that, America has. And so the Obama administration tried to cope with this. And in fact, we did see a decrease in the subsequent years in migration, in 2017, for example. And in addition to that, we saw, the number of, despite the fact that we're seeing lower numbers of people being apprehended, we're seeing a larger number of immigrants being detained, in addition to a larger number of immigrant children being detained, despite the fact that under the INA and under Flores, the children are not supposed to be detained normally, and that under the INA, that there's supposed to be an individual determination by the authorities about whether to detain a certain person, that people aren't supposed to be detained just as a matter of fact, in order to deter migration, that there needs to be an individual determination about whether or not this person poses a threat if they're to be released. And so we end up spending a lot of money on detention, both for children and adults. Well, in trying to deal with these problems, what President Obama did was he created the Central American Minors Program. We talked a little bit about that journey from Central America, particularly the Northern Triangle, which is comprised of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And under the Central American Minors Program, basically what happened is that the people from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras who are living in the United States lawfully could apply for refugee or parole status for their unmarried children under the age of 21 years. And the child had to undergo a screening interview, a medical exam, and if approved, their travel to the United States had to be pre-approved by the US government. And this program under the Obama administration allowed thousands of children who had lawfully residing parents in the US to avoid this really perilous land journey from Central America, the Northern Triangle, to the United States, where they might be subject to smugglers or human traffickers and even child sex traffickers. And so this was a way to protect them from, if they had family in the United States here lawfully, from having to migrate here in really dangerous conditions. In addition to this, in 2016, we also saw where more and more states were taking the position that the family detention centers that were created by President Obama, that such as the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas, and also Berks in Pennsylvania, that the state authorities said, you know what, these places don't meet our licensing standards. You're not running them in accordance with, you know, what's in the best interest of children as shown by regulations. And so we're not going to license these facilities. And this made it so that the federal government was basically forced to release children with their families, so that way they could adhere to the requirement that children be in places that are appropriate for them, which is either, you know, with their families, out in society, or in licensed facilities for that, you know, 10, 11% of children who can't be with their families. At the same time that all this was happening, with the rise of children and women coming to the United States, you also saw an increase in both for-profit and non-profit organizations starting to open up facilities, including mass facilities for children. Some of these are really corrupt, such as Southwest Key, but other ones are well-meaning. And basically, you know, what they're doing is they're providing immigration detention to children at a very high cost in settings that are largely totally inappropriate for children. And so basically, the United States should have known, should not have been surprised over the last few years that an increasing number of children would be coming to the United States, because that's what we've been seeing for most of this decade. And yet, despite that, in 2016, we had a situation where we suddenly were saying that we have a crisis. And if you look at, you know, the candidates, you know, we basically had one candidate, so at the time it was candidate Trump, who decided to frame the election, at least partially, on, you know, this perception that we were being invaded by all of these rapists and criminals, and they're bringing drugs. And the fact is that the greatest increase in, you know, migrants during this period were really children and women, the women largely being part of families, often with their children. And so this was a misrepresentation of what we were really seeing. In addition to that, we also started to experience this political polarization that I think all of us are familiar with at, you know, at this point in history, where, you know, we started to develop battlegrounds around immigration and what our attitudes were as immigrants, or were towards immigrants. And this has led to a lot of conflict around the issue of immigration. And then what happened was, in the midst of this really, you know, very painful election process, where we were basically fighting with one another all the time, and often about immigration, you know, we had a presidential election where we had the majority of voters choose one candidate, but the Electoral College chose another one, which means that the president doesn't have the full support of the majority of voters and doesn't have full support to the immigration policies that he used as a basis in his campaign and garnering support. Well, that takes us to 2017, which is our last visit before we have a discussion together. And then basically what happened is that in 2017, that President Trump decided to double down on this portrayal of an immigration crisis that didn't really exist when you talk about sheer numbers. That we're talking about, relatively few. If you look at the graph on the left-hand side of your screen, we're talking about relatively few immigrants in 2015, 16, 17. And then, when you talk about family unit apprehensions, yes, we had family unit apprehensions, but when that's compared to like the 1.6 million people that we saw around the turn of the century coming, we're not talking about a large, a significant number, especially when your immigration system is based upon a prioritization of, families and family reunification in addition to, worker qualification, skilled labor. And then in addition to that, as you see, 2015 saw a decrease in the number of kids coming to the United States. I'm looking at the graph over on the right-hand side at this point. And then we saw, some increase in 2016, and then it went back down again in 2017. And despite the fact that the numbers didn't look that bad, it was just really a changing demographic and who was coming to the United States, women and children coming for the purpose of asylum. One of the first acts that President Trump did was he passed what's commonly known an executive order. He issued what's known as the Muslim ban, is how it's commonly known. But the reason why it's important to me is because it, in addition to limiting asylum seekers and immigrants from certain countries, what it also did was it terminated the Central American Minors Program, which meant that you had a significant number of children who were in line to come to the United States legally under the CAM program so that they could be with their parents here. And instead, those children were forced, if they wanted to come to the United States, to travel through Central America and across Mexico, maybe on top of that, La Bestia, and to enter the country without documentation, where they could have been processed back in their home countries and put on a plane to be with their mom and dad here in the United States. In addition to the cancellation of the CAM program and that Muslim ban, what we discovered just this year is that the Trump administration developed a battle plan for how they were going to treat children and families coming to the United States, and that it appears to be primarily for these policies are primarily being developed and implemented for the purpose of deterrence and not in order to process on an individual basis these asylum seekers in accordance with the laws that we have assumed both at the federal level as well as internationally. And so during our next webinar together in January, what we're going to do is we're going to take a closer look at that memo and the different things that our government has done over the last 3 years in its war against children, which has included everything, from physically turning children away, which is illegal, and keeping them in cages, and a number of the kids that I found, were being kept in a warehouse, another one in a loading dock, more kids in a loading dock, others in what are essentially jail cells, not being given medical care, being separated from their parents on a widespread basis. All things that were outlined in this battle plan, which was leaked to Senator Merkley early in 2019. So at this point, I want to turn this over to some questions from all of you.
All right, we have a question from Maria. In your opinion, do you think the immigration crisis can be resolved while we are in a capitalist economy?
So I really don't see the immigration crisis as one that's being born primarily from capitalism. I think that there are lots of reasons why people migrate, but without question, the intertwined economies of the US and Central American countries and Mexico, that is contributing to the immigration crisis. And I think that what we need to do one of the things we need to do in order to combat the immigration crisis, and we'll talk about this in the third part of the series, is to support other countries at having strong economies so that they are not so dependent on the US for their economic stability. And so I think we do have to think about economics and trying to find a way forward for these, for human migration around the world. But I don't think that the problem really is a capitalist system. I mean, I do think that, as we know, we witnessed this in the United States, that there are elements of socialism that need to be part of a society, and we see that in areas like insurance. Some of these are government-run insurance programs, some of them are private-run insurance programs, but that's a form of socialism. So we need to have, I think, elements of a free market, but I think that we also have to have socialist, policies and systems that provide safety nets for people when they get sick or when they have a financial crisis or a death in the family and things like that. And we see those elements in lots of societies, including capitalist economies like the United States.
Right. Next question is from Bradley. What is the #1 priority towards larger immigration reform?
So I guess I think the answer to that is similar to what I just said. I think that the #1 priority, I think that first and foremost, I'm hesitant, and this is the reason why I'm hesitant, is that under international and federal law, migrants, children, and adults are supposed to be treated humanely. And under the law, their rights are supposed to be respected. And that's not what's going on here. So #1, we need to follow the law. Like everybody needs to follow the law. The government needs to follow the law. Immigrants need to follow the law. Parents need to follow the law. Everybody needs to follow the law, including the government. They need to respect the rights of everybody. But assuming that everybody's following the law, then I think it really is a matter of allowing countries to develop to the point that they have a certain amount of political freedom and political independence and economic independence so that they can meet the needs of their citizens so that they aren't forced to migrate. Now, on top of that, we, of course, are, on the cusp of climate change. I've already highlighted the fact that we've already entered into this period of increasing hurricanes and major, catastrophic events as a result of climate change that affecting human migration. And I think that another top priority needs to be to get greenhouse gases under control and develop international frameworks so that we can work together as a world community and start to develop and tap energy sources that don't destroy the planet and stop this greenhouse effect that is putting us into an irreversible cycle.
Right. Caitlin asks, would a better /physical barrier truly help?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. One of the things that I didn't talk about today, just because I knew we were running out of time, is the barrier. So the barrier, actually, a lot of people, think that Trump came up with the border wall, and he certainly is talking a lot about the border wall, and he's trying to expand the border wall. And I'll just share, I was in Mexico a couple of weeks ago interviewing children and families who are being kept there under the Remain in Mexico policy, the MPP policy. And while I was driving from a shelter where, a couple hundred kids were, maybe 800 kids and families were, we saw a small group of people like throw a hook ladder over the wall and just scale it in a matter of seconds, So, I'm not sure how effective, the border wall is. The thing is, I think that the fact is that most people don't come to America, most immigrants don't come to America overland. It's a minority. It's a very kind of old school view of how migration happens. That's not how it's happening. It's very expensive, and I think it wastes resources that could be better spent at ports of entry and developing technology that keeps the bad people out and the bad things out. We're all anti-gangs, we're all anti-drugs, and trying and anti-illegal arms being brought to the United States. And I think we absolutely need to be aggressive and going after those things. But what frustrates me is that we put so many resources into going after women and children. And women and children are not the threat to American democracy or the American economy. It's like these are asylum seekers, which not only are provided for under US law and under international law, but that we've affirmed a commitment to in both instances. So I think it's really important for us not to be misguided in our expectations about what a border wall will give us. You know, it's not gonna stop the bad people. And so I think that, you know, the border wall isn't very well designed, and that it's not a good use of resources, and that if we were to prioritize what we were really focused on, that modern technologies would do a better job of combating, you know, the real threats to the American border.
All right. So our last question is asked by a various group of viewers. How can we help?
Okay, so how can you help? So here's the thing. Everybody needs to vote. And I don't care whether you are a Republican, a Democrat, an Independent, a Green Party. I've been every single one of these. I'm a pretty nonpartisan person. I move among parties based upon basically, you know, children's issues. And it's really, really important that everybody votes. That not only do we vote and vote with an informed, educated understanding of where these policies are coming from and how misguided they are and how they hurt children and families, many of whom have a right to be here either because they have family here or because they are asylum seekers or they have other legal basis for being here. But in any event, recognize how misguided these policies are and the contributions that the U.S. has made in creating, you know, whether it's a real crisis or whether it's a manufactured crisis. The fact is that we really do have a border crisis right now, and that we have contributed to it. It's not something that just happened after the election in 2016. This is something that we have been contributing to as a nation for over 100 years now. And so it's important for us to be informed about it and to recognize that it's not a single bogeyman. It's not just Stephen Miller, you know, but it is, you know, it is part of a larger heritage that we have, that it's important for us to confront openly and honestly and take responsibility for, and then move forward by voting into office people who have a complex understanding of what are the real threats and what are the false threats, and can help us develop a legal framework and an enforcement of those laws that will combat what the real threats are. So number one is to vote. Number two is to educate others about these things. So this video will be made available publicly after this webinar. You're invited to share this video or any other informative, accurate videos about, you know, what the history of this crisis is, so that people understand the context in which all of this is happening. So educate other people so that they also can make informed votes. Three is to volunteer with organizations. So there are a lot of organizations that do work with this population, with both children and families. And so you can find organizations online, organizations that are both on the border and those that are further away from the border but work with local immigrant communities. Willamette is scheduling a service trip to the border in June. So Willamette alumni should get in touch with the alumni office in order to get registered for that trip. That'll probably be the third week in June, and we're going to do some service on the border, probably in Tijuana in June. So you can volunteer on that trip. And then lastly, let me encourage you to give. I know everybody has been giving and giving and giving and giving and giving, and we're all trying to create a better world, and we're all trying to share the limited resources that we have. But there are some really impactful places that you can give. You know, one is Willamette's clinical law program. But we are doing this work. We have been doing immigration and human rights work for about 13 years now. And we take a lot of pride. We feel like we've had a lot of impact in both children's lives and adult lives. You wouldn't believe the stories of some of the kids that we worked with and what they've escaped and, you know, come to the United States and are living with their families. We help set up guardianships for them. We help them to get special immigrant juvenile status. So if you would be willing to support Willamette University, in particular its clinical law program, we have an endowment and are always welcoming more contributions to that endowment. And then find other organizations as well. So read about RAICES, read about the National Center for Youth Law, read about the Center for Constitutional Law and Human Rights. read about the Young Center, and you can see which one, read about Project Amplified. You can see which of these organizations that's working with children and families really resonates with you. And with that, the last thing that I want to say is you can sign in next month, because next month we're going to talk about America's War on Children. And then in February, like I said, we're going to try and go over a bold vision for how we can move forward from this crisis that we seem to have created so that we can create a better world together. So I hope you'll come back next month and ask more questions, and I'll try and share more knowledge. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you to everyone that viewed today's webinar, especially those of you that asked questions. We would like to also thank Professor Binford for her engaging and informative presentation. Remember to tune in spring 2020 for parts 2 and 3 of this series. We'll see you next time on Bearcat Buzz.